Somewhere in the pale half-light of a Philadelphia morning, before carts had begun to creak over the rutted streets, and before the first shop shutters opened to the air, Benjamin Franklin was often already awake. The city around him still held the cool scent of river damp, ash from last night's hearths, wet timber, and the sour-sweet trace of animals kept close to crowded houses. In such an hour, the outlines of the town seemed softened by mist, and yet his own life was defined by the opposite quality, by precision, by attention, by the habit of noting how things worked, why they failed, and how they might be improved. He belonged to an age of candles, hand-set type, sailing packets, and long letters folded into themselves and sealed with wax. It was an age in which news moved at the speed of hoofbeats and tide, in which a winter crossing of the Atlantic could feel almost as uncertain as an expedition into legend, and in which the boundaries between tradesman, philosopher, politician, inventor, and public moralist were less rigid than they would later become. A printer could become a scientist. A self-taught man could advise kings. A provincial town, if it possessed enough ambition, could imagine itself a capital of thought. He was, in time, many things at once: apprentice and runaway, printer and essayist, civic organizer and political negotiator, experimenter with electricity and drafter of founding texts, loyal British subject turned American revolutionary, slaveholder turned critic of slavery, family man whose family life did not remain whole. The familiar portraits, with their composed expression and fur cap or spectacles, often suggest a finished and steady character, a man almost carved in his final form from the beginning. Yet the real life moved more restlessly than that. It shifted with circumstance, weathered setbacks, relied on chance meetings, and was marked by compromise as much as by principle. What made him remarkable was not only intelligence, though he possessed that in abundance, but a certain practical curiosity, a way of bringing thought down from abstraction into daily use. He looked at smoke in a room, letters in a postbag, lightning in the sky, waste in the street, quarrels in an assembly, and in each case he saw not merely a fact, but a system. Then, with patient energy, he tried to alter it. Some of those alterations were modest and local. Others moved through continents and centuries. To follow his story is to move from the narrow lanes of colonial Boston to the print shops of Philadelphia, from the drawing rooms of London to the salons of Paris, from the frail body of an old man in gout and pain to a public funeral watched by thousands, and beyond that into the long afterlife of reputation and myth. He was born on the 17th of January 1706 by the modern calendar in Boston, then a busy and constricted town at the northern edge of Britain's Atlantic world. The settlement clung to its peninsula with a kind of practical stubbornness, its streets irregular and intimate, its houses close together, its harbour always present as both livelihood and horizon. Salt air drifted inland from the wharves. Tar, rope, fish, wood smoke, and rendered tallow belonged to the ordinary perfume of daily life. This was no courtly city and no ancient capital. It was a place of work, prayer, commerce, and argument. His father, Josiah Franklin, was a maker of soap and candles, a trade that was essential, pungent, and unglamorous. His mother, Abia Folger Franklin, came from a family with its own New England history, rooted in the migration of dissenting Protestants who had crossed the ocean in the 17th century, seeking a life shaped more closely by their convictions. The household into which the future statesman arrived was large even by the standards of the time. Josiah had children from 2 marriages, and the rooms of the family home must have seemed full of movement, voices, labour, and the constant negotiation required when many lives share limited space. In such a setting, childhood did not unfold as a protected and separate realm. Work stood close beside it. Food, money, apprenticeship, religion, and obedience were subjects woven into the ordinary texture of the day. There was little room for indulgence, and not much patience for idleness. The father's business required materials that smelled strongly and lingered in clothing and on the skin, and the children would have known early the feel of tasks assigned, of tools handled, of time accounted for in useful output. Industry was not an abstract virtue in that world. It was survival. The Boston of his early years was shaped by Puritan inheritance, though by 1706 the first fierce generations of settlement had softened into a more commercially complex society. Sermons still mattered. Sabbath observance still marked the week. Questions of morality and public order carried weight in ways that would have been immediately visible in the rhythms of the town. Yet Boston was also a place tied to ships, trade routes, imported goods, newspapers, and the widening exchange of ideas. Merchants dealt in the larger empire. Sailors brought rumour and novelty. The town's life depended not only on doctrine but on circulation. For a brief time, he attended grammar school, where it became quickly apparent that he had ability enough for more formal education. Latin, rhetoric, and the hope of training for the ministry lay along one possible path. But the family could not support that expense for long. His schooling was cut short, and the interruption would remain important. It denied him the classical polish enjoyed by elite men of his generation, but it also spared him the confinements of a single profession and sharpened in him a lifelong habit of self-education. Books, once separated from the authority of schoolmasters, became something to pursue by appetite and discipline rather than merely by command. He read widely when he could, often borrowing volumes and returning them with care. The range of his early reading helped form the style of mind for which he became known: eclectic, utilitarian, alert to moral essays, scientific speculation, practical instruction, and clever prose. A child in a crowded household could find, in reading, a kind of private interior chamber. The page offered stillness. It also offered escape. Beyond the lane outside the Franklin home lay not only the harbour and the colonies, but the accumulated voices of Europe, antiquity, religion, satire, and philosophy. He entered that world without credential, but not without appetite. His father, hoping to guide a restless and intelligent son toward a stable future, tested him in various employments. The sea held attraction for the boy, as it did for many in Boston, but Josiah feared that path. A seafaring life promised danger, distance, and unreliable return. Better, perhaps, to tether such energy to a trade. In 1718, the young Franklin, at the age of 12, was apprenticed to his older brother James, a printer. This decision placed him in one of the most dynamic trades of the age. The print shop was a workshop of both hand labour and public influence. Type had to be set letter by letter, paper had to be inked, pressed, dried, folded, distributed. Yet what moved through the press was not merely paper. It was opinion, news, controversy, wit, instruction, and the shaping of a community's conversation. For a boy with a strong memory, a quick ear, and a growing hunger for expression, the apprenticeship was formative in the deepest sense. He learned the physical discipline of printing, the arrangement of cases, the reverse logic of type, the smell of lamp black and oil, the strain of long hours, the demand for exactness. He also learned the power of the printed word to stir, provoke, and organize public feeling. Boston's newspapers were still relatively new institutions, but they already mattered. The colony argued with itself in print. Clergymen, magistrates, merchants, and ordinary readers watched what appeared in columns and pamphlets. Those early years placed him at the seam between craft and public life. He was not yet free, not yet recognized, not yet anything like the familiar elder of American memory. He was only a younger son in a large family, shaped by scarcity, sharpened by books, and set to a trade that joined hand, mind, and society in one relentless daily routine. Still, the elements were there already. the distrust of waste, the respect for usefulness, the desire to improve conditions rather than merely complain of them, and the belief that knowledge should serve life as it is actually lived. In the narrow rooms of Boston, under the authority of family, religion, and apprenticeship, the outlines of his later character quietly took form. The apprenticeship to James Franklin gave him entry into the world of letters, but it did not give him ease. James was talented, ambitious, and not always gentle. In 1721 he founded the New England Courant, a newspaper more daring in tone than many colonial publications of the time, more willing to mock pretension, criticize authority, and adopt the brisk wit of English periodical culture. The younger apprentice worked in that atmosphere of typesetting and controversy, absorbing not only technique but voice. He saw that printed language could be playful, pointed, and socially dangerous. Yet he remained, in law and daily fact, subordinate. Apprenticeship carried obligations and restrictions, and in the print shop those could become acute. He longed not merely to handle words, but to produce them. Still young and uncertain of how to place himself into print without ridicule or prohibition, he tried an ingenious method. He composed letters under the fictitious name of Silence Dogood, a widow with a shrewd eye for human folly, and slipped them under the door for publication. James printed them, not knowing their author. Readers admired the wit and intelligence of the pieces. For the hidden writer, the episode must have brought both delight and danger. Delight in being heard, danger in the satisfaction of concealment, which could not last forever. When the authorship became known, the reaction was not wholly warm. A younger brother's cleverness did not necessarily flatter an older one. Tension in the household and shop grew sharper. The apprentice was already developing the confidence that would later serve him in diplomacy and politics, but in youth that confidence could look like insolence. Disputes with James became more serious, and the relationship deteriorated. In time, still in his teens, he broke from Boston altogether. The departure was not ceremonious. It was, in effect, a flight. He first went to New York, where he hoped to find work in printing, and then continued on to Philadelphia, arriving in 1723, with little money and an appearance later remembered for its plainness. The image became one of the durable scenes of his life, the awkward young runaway entering the city with a few coins, hungry, carrying rolls of bread under his arms as he walked Market Street. That picture has often been retold because it compresses so much of what later seemed emblematic: humility at the beginning, oddity, motion, and the sense that a life of consequence could begin in circumstances almost comic in their modesty. Philadelphia itself differed from Boston in temperament and texture. It was larger in possibility, less rigid in old religious authority, more open to trade and practical experiment, its streets broader, its civic culture more improvisational. Quaker influence gave the place a distinct moral and social character, quieter in some respects, less ceremonially hierarchical than English cities, though certainly not free of inequality. For the young printer, it offered exactly what Boston no longer did: distance from family control and the chance to invent himself. He found work, though not immediately security, and came under the notice of Sir William Keith, the governor of Pennsylvania, who encouraged him with promises that far exceeded practical support. Keith suggested that the talented young man establish his own printing business, and even hinted that backing would be forthcoming. Such encouragement was intoxicating to someone eager for advancement, and it shows a quality visible throughout his life. He was susceptible, at least in youth, to the persuasive tone of men in authority when it aligned with his own ambition. Believing Keith's assurances, he prepared for a venture that was not truly financed. That misjudgment carried him across the Atlantic. In 1724, he sailed to London, expecting letters of credit and solid arrangements, only to discover, upon arrival, that the promises had been hollow. The city that received him was immense compared to Boston and Philadelphia, dense with smoke, commerce, theatre, printing houses, taverns, and a scale of social inequality that colonial life only hinted at. London could educate by sheer vastness. It also had a way of reducing the pretensions of the inexperienced. He worked there as a compositor and pressman, learning from the metropolitan print trade while also confronting the instability of his position. The London years, though born of disappointment, were a stern education. He saw a society richer, more polished, and more chaotic than the colonies. He encountered free-thinking circles, more secular habits, and the bustling material culture of the imperial centre. He sharpened his craft, observed manners, and measured himself against a wider world. The experience stripped away certain illusions. It also strengthened his self-reliance. No governor's patronage could be safely assumed. Advancement would have to rest more securely on skill, thrift, networks, and calculated patience. In 1726, he returned to Philadelphia, helped for a time by Thomas Denham, a merchant who employed him and treated him with something like mentorship. When Denham died, the young printer again had to reorient his course. The uncertainty of those years should not be lost beneath the later image of composure. He was still forming, still vulnerable to bad judgment, still learning how easily a plan might dissolve. What distinguished him was not early invulnerability, but a capacity to convert setbacks into instruction. He began to gather around himself a circle of ambitious and thoughtful young men in Philadelphia, men interested in discussion, self-improvement, business, and public affairs. This group, later known as the Junto, reflected his instinct that advancement was not purely solitary. Conversation, shared reading, mutual criticism, and practical schemes could all assist a person in rising. At the same time, he continued to refine his prose by imitation and revision, training himself with a craftsman's seriousness. He took essays apart, rebuilt arguments, practiced brevity and clarity, and developed a style that could speak across levels of society without becoming vague. During this period, he also established a domestic connection that would shape much of his adult life. Deborah Reed, whom he had first known in his earliest Philadelphia days, became his partner in a common law marriage in 1730. Circumstances involving her earlier marriage, whose legal resolution remained uncertain, made formal ceremony difficult. Their household would be industrious, practical, and imperfectly joined, marked by long separations and mutual dependence. Around the same time, his son William, born out of wedlock and of uncertain maternal history, entered the household and was raised there. Thus, even before his public fame, the lines of family life were already somewhat complicated, carrying affection, secrecy, and future strain. By the close of his 20s, he had not yet become a world figure, but he had crossed oceans, broken from an apprenticeship, endured deception, laboured in London, returned wiser, and begun to assemble the habits and relationships that would sustain him. He was becoming, in the truest sense, self-made, though not in the simplistic later version that ignores luck, community, and the labour of others. His coming of age was neither smooth nor inevitable. It was improvised out of skill, pride, embarrassment, discipline, and a growing conviction that he might shape not only his own fortune, but the public life around him. In Philadelphia, prominence did not arrive suddenly, like a door flung open. It accumulated, day by day, in the patient manner of ink drying on paper or interest gathering on a prudent investment. He entered into business with Hugh Meredith, and in 1728 helped establish a printing house of his own. The practical demands were considerable. Paper was costly, presses required maintenance, contracts had to be won, and the competition for jobs and subscribers was steady. Nothing about the trade guaranteed success. Yet he possessed unusual advantages: industry, sociability, a talent for persuasive prose, and an instinct for what a growing city needed to read. By 1729 he had taken control of the Pennsylvania Gazette, and under his direction it became one of the liveliest newspapers in British North America. He filled its pages with essays, news items, satire, advertisements, moral reflections, and observations on civic life, always with an eye toward usefulness and readability. The newspaper helped him build not only income but visibility. Through it, he became known to merchants, artisans, officials, and ordinary readers. In colonial society, where elite families often held power through inherited standing, print offered another path, reputation earned in public through competence and voice. At the same time, he cultivated an image of methodical virtue that was both sincere and carefully managed. The famous program of moral self-examination, with its chart of virtues such as temperance, order, frugality, and humility, belonged to this period of inward discipline and outward self-fashioning. He treated character almost as if it were a business operation that could be improved by recording errors and correcting habits. There was a mechanical cast to the system, but also something deeply revealing. He believed that a life could be revised. Weakness need not simply be endured, it could be studied. That same belief shaped his public efforts. The Junto, which had begun as a discussion club, became a seedbed for civic projects. When a book was useful but scarce, he helped found a subscription library, the Library Company of Philadelphia, in 1731. In a society where books were expensive and scattered, the idea was transformative. Knowledge, shared through cooperative means, could extend beyond the wealthy few. The rooms that housed those volumes offered more than storage. They represented a new structure for self-improvement and public culture in the colonies. What followed was a series of similar endeavours, each arising from some observed deficiency in urban life. Philadelphia needed better fire protection, and so he helped organise the Union Fire Company. The city needed improved street maintenance, more regular policing, and institutions for mutual assistance. He wrote, proposed, persuaded, and arranged. His genius, if that word may be used quietly, was often administrative rather than theatrical. He could identify a need, describe it in plain language, gather support, and build a durable mechanism to address it. Such labour rarely looks grand in the moment, yet cities are altered by precisely that kind of attention. He also turned his wit and practical philosophy into one of the most successful publications of colonial America, Poor Richard's Almanac, first issued in 1732 under the name Richard Saunders. Almanacs were popular because they offered calendars, weather forecasts, household information, and brief amusements. His version added memorable aphorisms, worldly humour, and a tone of cheerful prudence. Many sayings later associated with him entered public memory through these pages. They praised thrift, labour, caution, and shrewd self-command, not as distant virtues for saints, but as habits for ordinary people navigating uncertain conditions. The almanac helped make him both profitable and familiar. His domestic life, meanwhile, ran alongside this public rise in a quieter register. Deborah managed much of the household and often the business side of affairs when he travelled. The partnership was more substantial than later heroic narratives sometimes allow. Colonial print culture depended on family labour, on shared management, on rooms where children, apprentices, paper, meals, and accounts might all coexist. Their son Francis, called Frankie, was born in 1732. His death from smallpox in childhood in 1736 left a wound that seems to have remained with the father, who had favoured inoculation and endured the bitter pain of losing a child despite his public confidence in rational improvement. The loss did not stop his work, but it deepened the human background against which that work unfolded. So much of his public philosophy emphasized prevention, planning, and wise conduct. Yet the world retained its power to wound without permission. Such moments complicated the calm surface of his maxims. They reminded him, and perhaps later readers, that prudence could not fully secure life against grief. By the 1740s, he had become one of Philadelphia's most prominent citizens, but his prominence rested on an unusual foundation. He was not simply wealthy, though he did become prosperous. He was not merely well-connected, though he cultivated networks skillfully. He was useful. That quality mattered in a colonial city still defining itself. A man who could print laws, organize subscriptions, propose improvements, and write persuasively on common concerns became difficult to ignore. He was also increasingly drawn toward larger fields of inquiry. Business success gave him time. Time permitted science, correspondence, and civic ambition on a broader scale. In 1748, he effectively retired from day-to-day management of printing in order to pursue public and intellectual interests more fully, though retirement in his case meant nothing like inactivity. It meant a shift in emphasis. He helped advance the establishment of the Academy and College of Philadelphia, which would later become part of the University of Pennsylvania. He played a role in founding Pennsylvania Hospital alongside Dr. Thomas Bond. He supported militia organization when frontier conflict made defense a pressing concern, though always in ways that reflected the political complexities of Quaker Pennsylvania. These activities reveal the circumstance that created his opportunity. Philadelphia was growing. The colonies were expanding in population, commerce, and ambition. Institutions lagged behind need. Imperial structures were present, but often distant or cumbersome. In such a setting, a disciplined and imaginative organizer could matter enormously. He stepped into that space, not because history had preordained him for greatness, but because he had learned to see gaps between what existed and what might be built. Others saw potholes, fires, ignorance, illness, postal delay, and scattered books as ordinary inconveniences. He saw them as invitations to invention. By the time his name began to travel well beyond Pennsylvania, he had already lived several lives in one: apprentice, runaway, London journeyman, printer, essayist, almanac maker, civic founder, husband, father, mourner, and public improver. The path to prominence had not depended on a single breakthrough. It had depended on sustained attention to the ordinary structures of life. Only later would that attentiveness expand from city streets and print shops to storms, empires, and constitutions. If the earlier part of his life showed how he learned to improve a city, the central decades revealed how far that habit of mind could travel. He moved with unusual ease between the intimate and the immense. A fireplace that smoked too much, a route of postal delivery that wasted time, a gap in medical care, a question about electrical charge, a quarrel between colony and empire, a war-ending treaty between nations. All these, for him, belonged to one broad field of practical intelligence. They differed in scale, but not in kind. His scientific investigations brought him perhaps the widest international fame before his revolutionary politics did. In the 1740s and 1750s, he became absorbed in the study of electricity, a subject that still possessed much of the wonder and uncertainty of an emerging science. European experimenters had generated static charge, observed sparks, and played with devices that seemed almost theatrical in their effect. He approached the matter with the seriousness of an experimenter and the clarity of a gifted expositor. Through letters, especially those sent to Peter Collinson in London, he described observations and proposed ideas in prose, at once exact and readable. He developed influential concepts and terminology, including the language of positive and negative charge, and advanced the idea that lightning and the electricity produced in experiments were fundamentally the same phenomenon. This insight was not the product of a single dramatic moment alone, though later memory fastened eagerly onto the image of the kite in a thunderstorm. Whether every element of that famous scene unfolded exactly as legend would have it, the underlying intellectual achievement remains substantial. He helped transform lightning from an object of awe and fear into something that could be studied, explained, and guarded against. The lightning rod followed. In churches, barns, homes, and public buildings, the rod offered a means of conducting electrical discharge safely to the ground, reducing the risk of catastrophic fire. It was one of the most elegant expressions of his philosophy. The device did not abolish the storm. It did not pretend that nature could be controlled in every respect. It simply redirected danger through a better understanding of causes. There was a quiet, moral likeness between the lightning rod and many of his civic reforms. Both assumed that misfortune often became ruin because people had failed to design wisely. Other inventions and improvements came from the same spirit. The Franklin stove, meant to heat rooms more efficiently and with less smoke, bifocal lenses, associated with his effort to accommodate both near and distant vision. Flexible urinary catheter design, reportedly created in response to a relative's suffering, observations on ocean currents, ventilation, and a variety of practical phenomena. He did not patent these innovations. In later reflection, he suggested that since many people had benefited from earlier inventions, it was fitting to serve others in turn without private monopoly. Whatever degree of idealism or self-presentation stood behind that sentiment, the effect was real. His name became linked with usefulness, shared rather than hoarded. Scientific reputation carried him into transatlantic learned society. He was elected to the Royal Society, received the Copley Medal, and corresponded with prominent intellectuals. For a man whose formal schooling had ended early, this recognition mattered deeply. It placed him among the Republic of Letters, that wide and somewhat idealized network in which learning crossed borders more gracefully than politics often did. Yet even here, he remained distinctively grounded. He wrote, not in ornate academic fog, but in a manner accessible to readers who wanted conclusions they could apply. Meanwhile, his public service within British America expanded. As Deputy Postmaster for the Colonies, and later Joint Postmaster General, he improved routes, accounts, and efficiency in ways that made communication more regular and reliable. The postal system seems, from a distance, almost mundane beside constitutions and revolutions. But in a dispersed colonial world, mail knit communities together. It carried news, commerce, law, family affection, and political coordination. To improve the post was to alter the pace at which society could think and respond. He also entered imperial politics more directly. The problem of colonial defense, especially during the tensions of the mid-18th century, pushed him toward broader political planning. At the Albany Congress of 1754, he proposed a plan for colonial union under a central governing structure. It was not adopted, and in later patriotic memory, the scheme sometimes appears as a kind of proto-American blueprint. Yet in its own moment, it was more ambiguous than that, intended partly to strengthen the British imperial system in North America. This matters because it reminds the historian that he did not begin as a revolutionary in waiting. He began as a reform-minded imperial subject, trying to make the empire function more coherently. His long involvement in London as a colonial agent sharpened that identity before eventually destroying it. He spent substantial periods there representing Pennsylvania and later other colonies in disputes over taxation, governance, proprietorial control, and imperial policy. London, in the 1750s and 1760s, presented itself as the centre of power, culture, and empire, and he moved within that environment with increasing skill. He visited drawing rooms, argued with officials, printed pamphlets, and tried to persuade ministers and members of parliament that colonial grievances were rational and remediable. At this stage, he still hoped reconciliation within the empire was possible. But the empire was changing, and so was he. The 7 Years' War had left Britain heavily indebted and more determined to assert control and raise revenue from its American possessions. Measures such as the Stamp Act intensified colonial resistance. He testified before the House of Commons in 1766 with remarkable composure and mastery, helping to make the case against the Act's enforcement. The performance enhanced his reputation immensely in America. He seemed a provincial who could meet imperial authority on its own ground and answer it without fluster. Still, the relationship between colony and crown continued to deteriorate. His own personal humiliation in the cockpit affair of 1774, when he was publicly berated before the Privy Council over leaked letters of Governor Thomas Hutchinson, marked a turning point. He had already grown disillusioned. Now he was also insulted in a manner designed to reduce him. The man who had spent years trying to reconcile imperial interests with colonial rights saw, with increasing clarity, that the distance between the two positions had widened into something like a breach. When he returned to America in 1775, he entered a world already moving toward war. The older imperial reformer was becoming a revolutionary statesman. He served in the Continental Congress, helped draft the Declaration of Independence, and took part in the work of organizing a new political order under conditions of danger and scarcity. If the Declaration bears most strongly the stylistic stamp of Thomas Jefferson, his role in editing, advising, and shaping consensus was important. He had by then become something like the elder of the movement, less severe than some, less doctrinaire than others, but immensely valuable in steadiness, humour, and judgment. Perhaps no service proved more consequential than his mission to France. Sent abroad in 1776, he arrived in a kingdom that was both sophisticated and unstable, a place of glittering court culture and deep structural strain. There he deployed one of the most subtle performances of public character in modern political history. The plain sage from America, dressed more simply than European courtiers, speaking with measured wit, carrying scientific fame and revolutionary legitimacy, became a sensation in Parisian society. Yet beneath the charm lay hard diplomatic labour. He needed money, military aid, naval support, and eventually formal alliance. Without France, the American cause might well have failed. He endured the slow grind of negotiation, the vanity of factions, the delicacy of court politics, and the burden of representing a fragile republic that did not always pay its own servants well or agree on policy. In 1778, he helped secure the Franco-American alliance, a decisive turning point in the war. Later, he played a central role in negotiating the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which recognized American independence and ended the conflict with Britain. Few achievements in his life had greater direct consequence. A man once deceived by a colonial governor in his youth now sat among the negotiators determining the fate of nations. And yet, even after such honours, he retained his older civic instincts. He never ceased to think in terms of mechanisms and institutions. In every sphere, he preferred arrangements that might continue working after the individual had gone. That is part of why his influence feels so diffuse and enduring. It lives not only in dramatic moments, but in habits of public life: libraries, hospitals, postal routes, civic associations, scientific societies, negotiated compromise, and the idea that practical knowledge can serve the common good. His achievements were many, but they were tied together by a consistent disposition. He tried, again and again, to make the world more intelligible and therefore more manageable for those who lived in it. No life as public and prolonged as his remains free of contradiction, and in his case, the contradictions are not incidental. They lie near the centre of the story. The familiar image of the wise old patriot, genial and enlightened, can obscure the more difficult truth that he was shaped by a world of hierarchy, empire, commerce, and human inequality, and that he participated in many of those structures even as he later criticized some of them. One of the clearest and most serious contradictions concerns slavery. During earlier decades of his life, he owned enslaved people and participated through business in a society where slavery was woven into economic and domestic life. His newspaper carried advertisements connected to the buying and selling of human beings, as colonial newspapers commonly did. In this, he was not exceptional for his place and time, but neither was he innocent of the system. The polished language of liberty that later surrounded the American founding did not immediately free him, or many others, from such entanglements. Over time, however, his views changed. The exact pace and depth of that change have been studied with care, and it would be too simple to present it as a sudden moral awakening detached from context. Yet the later evidence is plain enough. In the final years of his life, he became president of the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, and signed a petition to Congress urging action against the institution. That petition, submitted in 1790, stands in striking contrast to the earlier man. It does not erase what came before. It does show that he was capable, even very late, of revising positions shaped by habit and social convention. His family life also resists tidy celebration. Deborah Reed shared much of the burden of household and business, yet their marriage was marked by prolonged separations, especially during his long stays in London and France. She remained in Philadelphia while he lived abroad for years at a time. Some of this distance arose from practical circumstance and danger. Some of it also suggests a man increasingly drawn outward into public life, perhaps more at ease in political society and correspondence than in the sustained intimacies of home. Deborah died in 1774 while he was still in England, and he never saw her again after his departure years earlier. The fact sits quietly but heavily in the record. His relationship with his son William became, in a different way, one of the most painful fractures of his later life. William Franklin, intelligent and capable, rose to prominence as royal governor of New Jersey and remained loyal to the British Crown during the Revolution. Father and son, once closely connected, found themselves on opposite sides of a conflict that was political, moral, imperial, and deeply personal all at once. Their estrangement was severe. Even after the war, reconciliation remained partial and fragile. The father, who helped found a republic, could not fully keep his own household within one allegiance. There was also a tension between the moral image he cultivated and the more complicated texture of his private personality. The maxims of Poor Richard praised sobriety, diligence, modesty, and restraint, and in many respects he embodied these virtues. Yet he also enjoyed sociability, wit, esteem, and the play of charm. In France, especially, he moved within circles that admired him not only for his political and scientific importance, but for his ease in conversation and carefully managed persona. He could appear plain while understanding exactly what that plainness signified to others. Simplicity, in his hands, sometimes became a performance of simplicity, which is not quite the same thing. His writings, too, show complexity. He could be humane and broad-minded, but also sharply satirical, calculating, and unsentimental. His political conduct often favoured compromise and practical outcome over rigid doctrinal purity. Admirers call this wisdom. Critics sometimes call it opportunism. Both readings contain some truth. He was not a systematic philosopher seeking perfect consistency. He was a man of affairs, willing to bend toward what could actually be secured in an imperfect world. Another contradiction lies in his movement from imperial loyalty to revolutionary leadership. For many years, he sought accommodation within the British Empire and imagined that the colonies might flourish under a reformed imperial structure. Later generations, eager for clean origin stories, have sometimes read the revolution backward into his entire life, as though independence had always been his hidden destination. It was not. He changed, and the empire changed, and events closed doors that had once seemed open. This evolution makes him more historically real, not less admirable. It also reminds the listener that political identities are often formed through disappointment. His views on class and ordinary life carried their own ambiguities. He was celebrated as a self-made man, and frequently wrote for artisans and tradesmen in a language they could understand. Yet success also carried him upward into wealth, property, and international prestige. He knew hardship, but he did not remain in it. He valued common sense, but he also came to move with comfort among ministers, philosophers, diplomats, and aristocrats. He could speak to many social worlds because he had crossed among them, though not without absorbing some of each world's blind spots. There were gendered tensions as well, though they appear more diffusely in the record. Women around him often contributed labour, care, correspondence, and social mediation. Yet public memory centred overwhelmingly on the male world of printing, politics, and science. He could write with affection and intelligence about human relations, while still belonging to a culture that limited women's public authority and took much of their work for granted. The household, like the Republic, was not equally governed. All of this gives his life a more human contour. He was progressive in some matters and conventional in others, daring in some seasons and cautious in others, capable of tenderness and estrangement, public service and self-fashioning, moral revision and moral compromise. To smooth away such contradictions would be to lose the truth of him. History seldom offers pure examples. It offers people formed by their age, pushing against it here, submitting to it there, and sometimes changing in ways that surprise even their own earlier selves. In that sense, he remains not only important, but recognizable. When he returned from France in 1785, he was no longer the vigorous middle-aged improver of Philadelphia, or the agile diplomat who had captivated Parisian society. He was nearly 80 years old, internationally famous, often in pain, and entering the last act of a life that had already extended beyond the ordinary measure of his time. The Atlantic crossing itself, once an adventure of ambition, was now the journey home of an aged statesman whose body had begun to insist on its limits. Philadelphia received him with honour. The city had grown since the days of his early poverty and apprenticeship. Its streets, institutions, and public life bore marks of the world he had helped create, though they also belonged to a new generation. He was elected president of Pennsylvania's Supreme Executive Council, a position roughly equivalent to governor, and served from 1785 to 1788. Even in age, the public still wanted his name attached to authority. His reputation offered legitimacy in a republic still feeling its way into form. Yet the later years were quieter in texture, more inwardly shadowed. He suffered severely from gout and other ailments, including painful bladder stones and respiratory difficulties. Much of his work had to be conducted from a chair, a bed, or rooms arranged around the comforts and indignities of illness. Servants and family members attended to his daily needs. Visitors came to pay respects, seek advice, or simply behold the aging patriot. Such scenes have a stillness to them. The famous old man indoors, wrapped against discomfort, papers near at hand, conversation reduced by fatigue. The body now the chief negotiator of what the mind may attempt. His daughter, Sarah Franklin Bache, became especially important in these years, managing aspects of household life and serving as a stabilizing presence. The daughter, who remained close, offered a contrast to the estranged son across political and geographic distance. Family, in old age, becomes less abstract. It narrows to those who are there. The circles of celebrity matter less at night, in pain, than the ordinary constancy of care. He nevertheless continued to intervene in public affairs. At the Constitutional Convention of 1787, he was the oldest delegate present, physically frail but symbolically immense. The debates were often heated, the questions profound, the compromises imperfect. He spoke rarely, partly because of health, but when he did, His remarks carried the weight of age and lived pragmatism. He favoured accommodation where others nursed absolutes. The compromise spirit associated with the convention found in him a natural elder. One of his most remembered gestures came near the end, when he observed the carved sun on the back of George Washington's chair, and said he had long wondered whether it was rising or setting. Now, at last, he believed it was rising. The sentence endures because it gathered exhaustion and hope into one measured image. In those years, he also turned more openly toward anti-slavery activity. As president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, he lent his prestige to a cause that the new republic was not ready to confront fully. The petition sent to Congress in early 1790 represented both a final public act of conscience and an implicit acknowledgement of the unfinished moral work of the nation he had helped bring into being. The response was limited. Slavery would remain. Still, the gesture matters for the shape of his decline. Even while the body failed, the moral horizon of his thought did not simply contract into self-concern. There were griefs in memory as well as pain in the flesh. Deborah was long dead. Francis had been dead for decades. William remained, in important ways, a sorrow that never entirely settled. Public triumph could not dissolve those absences. The old man's household contained papers, portraits, objects, and rooms heavy with recollection. Every long life becomes, in part, an archive of those no longer present. As the months passed, his active world narrowed. Letters continued. Visitors still came. Intellectual interest did not leave him, but movement became difficult, breathing laboured, and ordinary actions more dependent on assistance. The image of Franklin that posterity often prefers is the lively inventor with kite and key, or the diplomat in spectacles charming France, or the printer preaching thrift. The final reality was more subdued and more universal. A celebrated man aging into dependence, carrying fame with him into the same frailty that claims the obscure. There is something fitting, though not sentimental, in the tone of these last years. He had spent a lifetime trying to improve worldly arrangements, and now he had to submit to arrangements that could not be improved beyond a point. Time, pain, and mortality offered no easy reforms. The practical mind could seek palliatives, better cushions, more efficient supports, attentive medical care, but no device would restore youth. In that sense, age presented him with the one system he could not redesign. And yet he did not recede into bitterness alone. Accounts from the period often preserve a certain composure, even humour in the face of illness. He retained enough of himself to converse, to advise, and to endure the ceremonial burden of being a living monument. That burden was real. Famous old age can become a kind of public property. Others see symbol where the aged person feels mostly fatigue. He bore that role as steadily as he could. By early 1790, the decline had become unmistakable. He spent increasing stretches confined indoors, his breathing troubled, his strength diminished. The Republic outside continued its noisy and uncertain beginning. The markets opened, legislatures argued, ships came and went, newspapers printed disputes. The ordinary world did not pause because one of its makers was dying. It seldom does. In that ordinary persistence, there is a quiet truth. Even lives that shape an era eventually pass back into the flow of days they once helped direct. He died on the 17th of April, 1790, in Philadelphia at the age of 84. The final illness had been prolonged and exhausting, marked by severe respiratory distress and the accumulated burden of age. Those around him had watched the familiar signs gather, the shrinking energies, the interrupted rest, the growing intervals of weakness. The sense that public renown no longer stood between the patient and the common terms of mortality. When the end came, it was not theatrical. It was the quiet conclusion of a long life in a city that had known him in youth, in maturity, in triumph, and in frailty. News of his death moved outward through the Republic and across the Atlantic with a speed proportionate to the communication networks he had done so much to improve. Newspapers printed notices and reflections. Citizens, who had never seen him in person, felt that some shared national elder had passed. In Philadelphia, mourning was both official and popular. An estimated crowd of many thousands followed the funeral procession, a remarkable number in a city of that era. The streets through which he had once walked as a hungry youth now received his coffin with ceremony and collective memory. He was buried in Christ Church burial ground beside Deborah, the wife from whom long absences had separated him in life more than in death. The pairing carries its own quiet irony, not bitter but human. Time and burial sometimes restore a proximity that life did not perfectly sustain. Public responses emphasized different aspects of his character according to the needs and sympathies of the speaker. Many Americans praised him as a patriot, philosopher, and friend of liberty. Scientific communities remembered the investigator of electricity. Civic leaders recalled the founder of libraries, hospitals, and other institutions. Printers remembered one of their own raised to extraordinary height. Abroad, especially in France, his death prompted notable expressions of respect. In the National Assembly, he was honoured as a benefactor of mankind, and the gesture reflected the breadth of his reputation beyond national boundaries. At the same time, immediate legacy is never wholly unanimous. Loyalists, conservatives, and critics of the revolution had reasons to remember him differently, as a man whose talents had served rebellion against lawful authority. Some found his late-life anti-slavery position uncomfortable or inconvenient. Others admired him while distrusting the more democratic tendencies of the age he had helped inaugurate. Even in death, then, he was not a neutral figure. Great public lives seldom become simple at the moment of burial. His unfinished autobiographical writings played an important role in shaping what came next. In them, he offered not a full confession in the later romantic sense, but a carefully arranged account of self-making, discipline, and worldly progress. Readers found in those pages a compelling model of how a person of modest beginnings might rise through effort, prudence, literacy, and civic engagement. The text would become one of the foundational stories Americans told themselves about America. Yet, because the author was so skilled in self-presentation, the autobiography also subtly directed posterity towards certain emphases and away from others. Even his afterlife in memory bore traces of his editorial hand. What was mourned most deeply may not have been any single achievement, but the unusual breadth of the life. Few figures of the 18th century seemed to belong simultaneously to so many worlds. He had been colonial and cosmopolitan, practical and speculative, commercial and civic, scientific and political. Such range made him useful to a young republic hungry for symbolic ancestors. Different constituencies could claim him without feeling they had entirely distorted him. There is also a quieter dimension to the immediate legacy. For those who had known him personally, his death meant the disappearance of a voice, a habit of conversation, a face familiar in rooms and letters. History tends to convert such losses into categories: statesman, inventor, founder. Yet the first experience of death is often local and intimate. A chair sits empty, a correspondence stops. The pattern of visits changes. Household sounds alter. The public world eventually produces memorial language. Private grief begins in smaller silences. Within a few years, and then across generations, the outlines of remembrance would harden. Portraits, anecdotes, maxims, schoolbook summaries, and national mythology would simplify what the living funeral crowd could still sense in fuller measure. That the man lowered into the ground had not been only one thing, and that his greatness such as it was, had been built not by grandeur of birth, but by long discipline, curiosity, adaptation, and the stubborn labour of remaining useful in many changing circumstances. What remains after such a life is not only a set of famous scenes, but a pattern of influence woven through ordinary institutions and enduring ideas. Libraries opened their doors in part because he believed books should circulate beyond private wealth. Hospitals and civic associations bear the mark of his conviction that communities need structures of mutual aid. Scientific culture remembers his clarity of experiment and explanation. Political history remembers the negotiator who helped hold fragile coalitions together and persuade foreign powers that an improbable republic might survive. American memory, in particular, has long found in him a figure both comforting and elusive. He seems to promise that intelligence need not be aristocratic, that public usefulness may arise from trade and craft, as well as from inherited rank, that wit and practicality can inhabit the same mind, and that a life may pass through several identities without losing coherence altogether. Yet the longer one looks, the less simple he becomes. The printer was also the diplomat. The moralist was also the self-inventor. The apostle of liberty had known complicity in unfreedom. The advocate of domestic virtue spent long years far from home. The father of compromise also helped midwife a revolution. Perhaps that is why he endures. He does not fit neatly into sainthood. He remains available to admiration, but not without qualification. He belongs to the founding of the United States, yet he also exceeds it, because his interests ranged through science, language, city life, weather, reading, commerce, education, and the daily mechanics by which human beings make their world more livable. His legacy is therefore not only national, it is civilizational in a quieter sense. He represents the hope that thought can be practical, that reform can begin with what is nearest at hand, and that curiosity, if joined to patience, may alter more than private fortune. There is also something restful in the shape of his example. He did not conquer by force. He did not rule by terror. He built, wrote, tested, organized, persuaded, revised, and endured. Even his fame often rested on devices and arrangements meant to lessen danger, broaden access, or connect scattered people to one another. Such work rarely appears as dramatic as battle, yet history depends on it no less. And so he passes from the record of days into something quieter, a presence still felt in the institutions he helped begin, in the language he sharpened, in the republic he served, without ever fully simplifying. The streets of Philadelphia no longer smell as they did in his youth, and the presses he knew have long since fallen silent. Yet the patient energy of his life remains legible beneath many later layers of time. It is enough, perhaps, simply to have known the story, to let it grow still now and settle gently into the dark.